Have you ever thought about the butterfly effect of your own existence? Like, if your great-grandparents hadn't endured a specific hardship, maybe they wouldn't have met, and you simply wouldn't exist. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating paper by Jeremy W. Skrzypek called A Superior Non-Identity Theodicy. It takes this exact idea, the fragility of our existence, and uses it to tackle one of the oldest questions in philosophy: why an all-powerful, all-loving God would permit suffering.
Right. It is the classic problem of evil, but Skrzypek looks at it through a very specific, highly metaphysical lens. He is evaluating something called a non-identity theodicy. Basically, a non-identity theodicy tries to explain God's permission of suffering by leaning on claims about the identity conditions of creatures. It usually relies on a concept called Orion's essentialism. This is the idea that the specific circumstances in which you first come into existence are absolutely essential to you being you. If a different sperm and egg fused, or if the timing was even slightly off, that wouldn't be you. It would be a completely different person, or no one at all.
So, to unpack that step by step, the first part of this framework is that God deeply desires to create and be in a loving union with specific people. Say, God specifically wants you to exist. But because of Origen's essentialism, to get exactly you, God has to arrange or permit the exact historical conditions that led to your conception. And that means permitting all the events leading up to it, including the pain and suffering of every generation before you. It is kind of mind-blowing because it shifts the justification of suffering away from cosmic, impersonal goods, like the overall elegance of the universe, and makes it deeply personal.
Exactly. The great good here is loving personal union with specific individuals. But Skrzypek points out that despite this impressive setup, Origen's essentialist non-identity theodicies have two fatal flaws. Let's look at the first major worry, which is a violation of what is known as the same subject condition. This condition states that any justification for a person's suffering must provide some good for that very same person who is suffering. There is a weak form of this, which just says the sufferer has to get some sort of good, and a strong form, which says the sufferer must be the primary beneficiary of the good that justifies their pain.
And Origen's essentialism totally fails this, right? Because if my suffering is permitted strictly to ensure that someone in the next generation is born, then my suffering is just a tool. I am not the beneficiary. Think about a tragic case, like a young child suffering from terminal cancer. Under this Origen essentialism view, their suffering might be permitted solely so that the parents' lives change in a way that leads to the conception of a specific sibling years later. The suffering child is essentially being used as a mere means to an end rather than an end in themselves. That feels morally deeply uncomfortable.
It does, and philosophers have recognized this. Skrzypek meticulously goes through 4 major responses from other thinkers who try to rescue the theory from this exact violation, and he systematically rejects all of them. This dialectical cascade is really the heart of the paper. So, let's break them down. The first response comes from Marilyn McCord Adams. She suggests a general policy response. Her idea is that the good doesn't come from the specific instance of suffering itself, but rather from God's general policy of creating and sustaining a world where these causal chains happen.
But Skrzypek rejects that, because it is just too ambiguous, isn't it? Saying the good comes from the policy doesn't actually justify why that specific terrible thing had to happen to that specific person. It dodges the core requirement of the same subject condition. So what was Adam's second attempt?
Her second attempt is much more complex and heavily debated. She relies on the concept of narrative self-interest. Adams argues that your life, including your suffering, shapes your narrative identity, making you who you are. She claims that if you were offered a life without those past traumas, you wouldn't want it, because you wouldn't want to become a fundamentally different version of yourself. Therefore, the suffering is justified because it secures your narrative identity.
Okay, I see the appeal of that. It is like a teenager who goes through a really tough, rebellious phase, suffers a lot, but comes out with a completely transformed, deeper personality. They might look back and say, I wouldn't change it, because that pain made me who I am today.
Right, but Skrzypek pushes back hard here, and he brings in Bernard Williams' famous thought experiment from The Self and the Future. Williams asks us to imagine a scenario where you are told that tomorrow your brain will be completely wiped, you'll get new memories, a new personality, and then you will be tortured. Do you fear the torture? Intuitively, yes, you are terrified. Even though your narrative identity will be completely different, it is still metaphysically you experiencing the pain.
Oh, that completely dismantles the narrative argument. Williams is showing that our practical survival concerns track our metaphysical identity, not our narrative identity. So, even if the teenager's personality changed, metaphysically, they are the same subject. They could totally and rationally wish that they had never gone through that suffering while still remaining metaphysically themselves. Adam's narrative self-interest response fails to justify the suffering to the actual metaphysical subject.
Exactly. So then we move to the third response, which comes from Haderlie and Miller. They propose a collective good response. They suggest that the suffering is justified because the sufferer becomes part of a collective, specifically the body of Christ or the heavenly kingdom, where the ultimate collective joy outweighs the individual pain.
But wait, that has a glaring theological loophole. What about the unsaved? Or what about people born long after Christ? If their suffering is just leading up to someone else's existence, and they don't get to participate in that specific heavenly collective good, they are still just being used as a means.
Spot on. That brings us to Haderlie and Miller's final attempt, the fourth response in this sequence. This is the contentment response. They argue that as long as the sufferer eventually experiences enough good in their life or in the afterlife to be content with their overall existence, the suffering is justified.
I can see Skrzypek's objection coming from a mile away based on what we defined earlier. That only satisfies the weak form of the same subject condition. Sure, the sufferer gets some kind of good eventually, but they are absolutely not the primary beneficiary of the specific suffering. The primary beneficiary is still that future person whose existence required the pain. So, going through all four responses, Adam's policy, Adam's narrative self-interest, Haderlie and Miller's collective good, and their contentment theory, none of them successfully rescue Origen's essentialism from violating the strong same-subject condition.
Precisely. And if that wasn't enough, Skrzypek introduces the second major worry, the last generation problem. If the whole point of God permitting suffering is to ensure the specific historical conditions required to birth the next generation, what happens when humanity ends? How do you justify the suffering of the very last generation of human beings? There is no future person relying on their pain to be born.
That is a massive structural flaw. If there is no next generation, the entire justification collapses. How have philosophers tried to patch that up?
Skrzypek looks at John Vitale, who laid out three possible solutions for this last generation problem. Option 1. God simply ensures the last generation doesn't suffer. But that seems absurdly unfair to all previous generations and doesn't match the reality of a world ending. Option 2. There is no last generation. Humanity goes on infinitely. But for orthodox theology, that destroys the concept of a final judgment and the ultimate heavenly union. Option 3. We just bring in a different separate theodicy to explain the last generation's suffering.
But that third option is terrible for a philosophical theory. It is completely ad hoc. If you have a unified theory of everything, but then you have to bolt on a completely different theory just to explain the last 5 minutes of human history, your original theory is fundamentally broken. So Vitale's three options all fail. Where does Skrzypek go from here? He has torn down Origen's essentialism. What is his solution?
This is where we hit step 5 of his argument, and he introduces a radical upgrade. He argues we must move from Origen's essentialism to a much stronger identity thesis called superessentialism. Superessentialism is the thesis that literally every single event in your life, not just your conception, is essential to your identity. Your entire, complete life history defines you. If even one stubbed toe or one major tragedy in your life had been different, you would not be the same metaphysical person.
Whoa! So, under superessentialism, my suffering isn't just necessary to produce my great-grandchildren. My suffering is fundamentally necessary for me to be me.
Exactly. And watch how beautifully this solves the two massive worries we just discussed. First, it perfectly satisfies the strong same-subject condition. Why did God permit you to suffer? Because, without that specific suffering, you would not exist. And since your existence and your potential union with God is an ultimate good, you are the primary beneficiary of your own existence. You are no longer just a means to produce the next generation. The suffering is justified directly to you, for your own sake.
That is incredibly elegant, and it immediately solves the last generation problem too. Because the last generation's suffering isn't about producing a future generation anymore. Their suffering is essential to their own existence. God permits the suffering of the final humans because without it, those specific final humans wouldn't exist for God to love. It makes the entire timeline consistent. Though, I have to point out, this is a very heavy metaphysical commitment. Thinkers like Kripke, Parfit, and Mondadori have wrestled extensively with the nature of identity and essential properties. And in the paper, Skrzypek notes that both Adams and Vitale actually considered superessentialism but explicitly rejected it. Why did they reject it?
They rejected it because it is an incredibly strong, almost restrictive claim. Skrzypek is very honest about making a concession here in his conclusion. Superessentialism is demanding. It essentially implies that you have no genuine alternative possibilities for your life. You couldn't have chosen a different college or avoided a certain illness and still been you. For many philosophers, and for our common sense, that feels too rigid.
Right? It feels like it threatens free will, or our intuitive sense that our lives could have gone differently. If every single event is essential to my identity, then the concept of what if completely disappears.
It does. But Skrzypek's counter-argument is that Origen's essentialism isn't really that much better on this front. If you trace the causal chain of your conception back through history, the conditions required for your birth are so impossibly fragile that, practically speaking, Origen's essentialism also locks down the timeline. So if you are already willing to swallow the heavy metaphysical pill of Origen's essentialism to solve the problem of evil, you might as well take the slightly heavier pill of superessentialism because it actually fixes the logical holes in the Theodicy.
That is a phenomenal dialectical move. He isn't claiming it is flawless, but he is doing a comparative analysis. So, what is his exact final stance at the end of the paper? He doesn't say superessentialism is absolutely the ultimate truth of the universe, right?
No, he is very careful and precise. His actual conclusion is exactly this. There are great goods or benefits to be gained by supplementing a non-identity theodicy with a commitment to superessentialism. He doesn't assert that superessentialism is definitively the correct identity thesis, nor does he say Origen's essentialism is entirely false. He simply proves that if you are building a non-identity theodicy, superessentialism is the superior structural foundation because it resolves the same subject violation and the last generation problem.
That is a masterclass in philosophical argumentation. It is like he took a complex engine, showed exactly why the current parts cause it to stall at two specific points, and then machined a new, heavier part that makes the whole thing run smoothly, even if the new part makes the engine a bit heavier to carry. It leaves us with a lot to chew on regarding identity, suffering, and what it truly means to be ourselves.